Hi there. It's Gilbert, and I'm popping in a little early to give all you loyal podcast listeners a quick note. Soon, only eligible Time subscribers will be able to fully access this show, the Book Review Podcast, on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Now, what does that mean? The most recent episodes will still be available for free, but you'll need to subscribe to The Times or to The Times Audio in order to access our very robust archive of hundreds of interviews and book discussions. I hope you'll consider subscribing. By doing so, you'll be supporting the audio journalism we do here at the Book Review, as well as across our slate of podcasts. Learn more and subscribe at nytimes.com/podcasts. Okay, on to the show. I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review, and this is the Book Review Podcast. This week, I'm joined by Jean Hanff Korelitz. Her 2021 novel, The Plot, was a literary thriller about the world of literature, the world of writing fellowships and failed careers and once promising authors fading into oblivion. Her new novel, called The Sequel, is a sequel to The Plot, a direct sequel. And as such, we'll be discussing some key twists from Jean's first book, and if you haven't read that one, you should do so, and then come back and listen to this conversation. Jean, welcome back to the Book Review Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
You were last here for The Plot. Naturally, you couldn't really talk about any of the twists in that book. I'm hoping we can do so a little bit today in order to segue into talking about the sequel. But first, big picture, sequels don't always live up to the original. In the text of this very book, you have an agent that says, sequels can be very enticing when the initial book is done well. Readers want to know what happens to a character they've connected with, but they're never as good as the first book, are they? Obviously, you baked that in. You needed to put that in.
I sure did.
Why did you decide to write a sequel?
Oh, why did I decide to write a sequel? I didn't, actually. It just popped into my head. I've never set out to write a sequel, let alone any kind of a series. In general, I don't read series. I can think of one or two exceptions to that, but I never read A is for Alibi or B is for or C is for or any of that. I just am more of a kind of standalone kind of reader. But this character was just too delicious to let go of. She's a pretty terrible person. I mean, I do love a terrible character, a terrible protagonist, but this one kind of broke all the boundaries for me. And I found myself wondering what happened next. And also what would happen if she herself became a writer, because she's so famously disdainful of writers. What would it be like if we watched her try to write a novel and find out just how hard it really is?
Why don't you tell us a little bit about this character? This is where, as we discussed before we started taping, you will have to spoil a little bit of the plot. But why? Where did we leave off with Anna at the end of the plot, and where is she now when we pick up?
First, it is slightly liberating to be able to even have this conversation, because in general, I tend to run in the other direction when people ask me what the plot is about. When the plot was coming out, we were very deliberate about the information that we would share up front. But there are major twists that obviously I did not want to reveal. I vividly remember the day somebody ruined Murder on the Orient Express for me on the school bus on my way to high school, and I never want to inflict that horror on anybody else. But in this case, everybody's been warned, and one hopes that your listeners have read the plot. The plot is about a failed writer who does something strictly correct and yet morally hazy. He appropriates the story, not the language, but the story that originated with another writer who then died without having written his own book. He writes a novel which becomes basically the fulfillment of every writer's fantasy. It is a massive bestseller. It is an Oprah selection. It is going to be adapted by Steven Spielberg. He is set for life. He is enjoying all of the acclaim and approbation that he fantasized about. And in the middle of his triumphant book tour, somebody anonymously accuses him of having basically done the exact thing that he did, which is steal his story. And he spends the rest of the book trying to find out who that person is. only to discover that that person is uncomfortably close to him and with a very specific agenda of her own, which she then accomplishes in the final pages of the novel, which brings us to the beginning of the sequel, when that person, Anna, his now widow, is representing him on a book tour of his final book. And in the course of answering these questions about the tragic loss of her husband to suicide, she's asked, "What's next for you?" And out pops a surprising statement, "I'm thinking of writing a novel of my own." She gets so much approval for this that she says it again, and then she says it again, and she says it again. And suddenly she finds herself in a situation where she is being asked to produce this novel, and then she does. So that's where we find Anna at the beginning of the sequel.
And when did you know in the writing of the plot, maybe, that Anna would be the load-bearing character in the story? Like that the book was always going to eventually or inevitably be about her, not necessarily about Jacob, even though we think it's about Jacob the whole time.
I really didn't know. I didn't know that she would get her own book. I didn't know that her story would continue. But of course, I do love a Ripley. I think many of us do. And it was just too tempting to see what would happen next to her. So there wasn't a grand plan. I was very much in the dark myself when I finished the plot. I had no idea that I would be sitting here again with a new novel about this character.
And when did you realize that? Were you on the verge of starting another book and then you couldn't get Anna out of your head?
I did not have a book in mind. I often have these big gaps between books. You leave it all on the field and then you mope around thinking, I'll never write again. I'll never have another idea. And that's the phase that I was in. But I did have something else going on in my life. I was moving, which meant, as you can imagine, many books to pack. And I think I remember that I was taking books down from a shelf and they were dusty and wiping them off and putting them in the box and taping up the box. And somewhere in the process of that, this idea just popped into my head. I wonder what would happen if Anna actually wrote that book. And then somebody came after her. And often when you get an idea like that, you think to yourself and then you just put it in your pocket and go on with your life. But it's there and now you're thinking about it. And then there comes a critical point where it's harder not to write than it is to write. And that's when I sat down and started to write.
Where did you move to?
We moved from the Upper West Side of Manhattan to South Street Seaport, which is a neighborhood that I had barely ever set foot in my entire life. And I love it.
I love that. I've been going there since I was a kid. We're back to when it smelled down there, when there was an actual fish market.
Yeah. Now the fish market is a very posh food mecca called the Tin Building.
Yeah. And there's a beautiful bookstore down there, of course.
There is indeed. And you know, it's so funny. When The Latecomer came out and my publicist at Celadon said, they've offered you a reading at South Street Seaport's McNally Jackson. And I said, can't we do one of the other McNally Jackson's? Who goes to the seaport? And 6 months later, I was living 2 blocks away.
This is not an ad for McNally Jackson, but it's a gorgeous bookstore.
It's so beautiful. It has beautiful beams. I've been to many events there. It's just a terrific place.
How many times after you released the plot and you were out on tour, perhaps, or out at bookstore events, did people come up to you with glee in their eyes and say, I figured it out halfway through?
Well, first of all, I didn't have a book tour. I've actually never been on a proper book tour. That was all made up in the sequel. A lot of kind of years of fantasizing about what a book tour would be like. It happens a lot, but I don't take it very seriously because when they say I figured it out, they're telling me that they knew that there was something about the character that they suspected. But I haven't given them enough information to know the answer to the mystery that they are claiming to know the answer to. So I don't challenge them on that because it would be unseemly to do so. But I think, many readers, especially for a plot-driven novel, a mystery or a thriller, they read competitively. The minute they open the cover, it's them against the author. I have to admit I'm a little bit that way myself, but only because I'm so hard to surprise. In my family, people are always trying to show me plots that I can't figure out. And I think my son, this reached the height with my son taking me to see Get Out. He said, I found the plot that you're not going to guess. I'm going to take you to this movie. And about 5 minutes in, I leaned over and said, okay, this is what's going to happen. And he goes, oh my God. So yeah, they don't even try anymore. But it's very rare that a book will really surprise me.
Oh, you're like the person that goes to The Sixth Sense and 10 minutes in,
it was so obvious.
Ruin it. I have a friend who claims, I can't remember who it is, friend out there, that they figured out The Sixth Sense in the first 15 minutes.
Sure, why not?
And they lord it over people.
Yeah.
And it's quite annoying.
And I actually wrote this in a novel once. All ghost stories end in one of two revelations. I'm dead or you're dead. There's no third option.
What about we're dead?
Maybe that's a third one.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Could be we're dead. Sure.
Great. I can't wait for the trilogy here where you write a ghost story with Anna. So that gets me to thinking about genre, which you've spoken about before, or you've spoken about it through a lens of plot. And as you've said in other interviews, you started perhaps as a writer who wanted to write in the literary vein. I'd love to hear what you actually thought that meant or what you think that means. But you found that plot was a thing that you couldn't stay away from. And I find that it is very odd that those two things have to be in opposition.
Isn't it? I would solve that problem. It's not one of the world's great problems, but it is a minor, enduring problem. I started as a poet, actually, and I only wrote poetry until my mid-20s. And that is because I was so afraid to write fiction. I eventually understood that given the chance to reach for the slender book of poems or the big, fat Victorian novel, I was always going to go for the novel. And eventually I did find the wherewithal to attempt it and fail. The first two novels were not published. That took years. That was one quick sentence, but it took years. And finally, I decided I would write a novel that somebody would publish. It was 1992. My older child had just been born, and I really had this feeling that I was out of time to be artistic. And now I needed to write something that would be published. And what I wrote was a legal thriller. And it was published, and that was amazing. But then I had a different problem because my publisher wanted me to write a sequel with A is for Alibi kind of situation. Mm-hmm. And I just recoiled. I couldn't do it. I didn't want it. I wanted to be a literary novelist. And so I had to leave my hard-won publisher. And thus began my wanderings through publishing. And I might write a plot-driven novel and have one kind of publisher, and then they would reject the next one because it was too literary, and back and forth until finally I managed to find myself with an agent and a publisher who understood that I would not or could not stop doing what I was doing. I had eventually reached the conclusion that I love a plot-driven novel, but it has to be well written or I can't read it. And I love literary fiction, but literary fiction without plot is just untenable for me. I need both. And eventually I discovered, or was discovered by, the readers who agree with me. They want both too.
And to you, literary fiction is just something that in which attention is paid to the language more so than it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
The knock against literary fiction, which many would say is its own genre, although you never find it under literary fiction in a bookstore, is this very thing. Oh, so beautiful, but nothing happens. Which was the book of yours that made you realize, I can do this? I can actually meld the two.
I'm not sure I ever reached that conclusion, but if that conclusion was reached by readers, it probably happened with You Should Have Known, which eventually would become The Undoing on HBO in a very altered form. You Should Have Known has these classic thriller tropes, a missing husband, a dead body, a lot of buried secrets. And yet it was really a novel about a woman in midlife whose life is being stripped away from her and who then recreates her life. The whole second half of the novel was not a part of the television series. So when it became a television series, it was transformed into a whodunit. And it was such a whodunit that I didn't know who did it. the night that the final episode aired, and I hadn't seen it. I'd seen all the episodes up until the final one. My husband and I were getting ready to watch it, and I said to him, "Who do you think did it?" And he told me, and I told him who I thought did it. We were both wrong. That's called an altered story.
I have to say that seems like an incredibly unique experience.
Yeah.
Even though writers are used to having their work adapted and certain changes being made, this is a very extreme example.
I had learned to let go of the process of adaptation with Admission, because even though Admission was far less altered than You Should Have Known, it felt like a radically different story by the time it hit the screen. It was much more comedic. It had been tailored for Tina Fey. But also the screenwriter, who did a wonderful job, moved the big twist way up to the front of the story, and it was just a very different experience.
Has watching these adaptations of your work made you think differently about structure in any way? Because I feel like one of the themes that unites those two is structure, when things are revealed to the audience, for example.
I don't have any hard and fast rules about it. I tend to try to write as if I were the reader, or as if the reader were reading over the shoulder of the writer, and constantly asking, what do I need to know? What is not necessary for me to know? What can I continue to hide? So there's a lot of moving of pieces around. And often I'll get to the end and realize that I put some of the pieces in the wrong places, and then I have to go back and move them around. But I never plan ahead. This will happen, this will happen, this will happen. It's a much more feeling your way in the dark kind of process.
Murder on the Orient Express aside, and
I'll never forgive her.
Yeah, whoever that is. What did you read when you were a kid that sort of allowed you to revel in the joy of plot and mystery and suspense and surprise?
I've just done the By the Book series for the New York Times Book Review, and one of the stories that I tell in that is the experience of becoming an atheist at age 8 or 9 in the final pages of D'Aulaire's Book of Greek Myths, which I now feel is the single most important book I've ever read. The joys of storytelling were only a part of that. But absorbing the incredible spectrum of Greek mythology, I think, did a lot to make me a storyteller. The atheism was a side effect. And on the penultimate page, this is not a short book, it's several hundred pages long. On the penultimate page, the Greek gods all get new names because Rome has conquered Greece. Now they all have Roman names. And you think, okay, I understand. A god can have a new name. Maybe that's part of the god experience. Every now and then you get a new name. And then you turn the page, the final page of D'Aulaire's Book of Greek Myths, the gods have died. Because the civilization has died. The civilization that made them has passed into history, and with it, the gods have passed. Ask yourself, who is worshiping Jupiter or Zeus today? Not too many people. And it just hit me. We made them. They didn't make us. And I remember exactly where I was. I was on a bench in Central Park. I think I was sitting out a gym class because I had some malady or injury or something. And I had brought my book out to read it. And I thought, that makes sense to me, and I have never changed my mind about it.
What did your parents say when you went home?
They were they were there way before me.
Oh, really?
It wasn't a, Mom, Dad, I got to tell you. No, it was, we were all on the same page with that.
That's why they gave you the book. They knew how you would react. I don't
even remember who gave me the book, but I got to tell you, this is my default gift for newborn babies. I give them D'Aulaire's Book of Greek Myths. I'm not trying to be an evangelist for my particular breed of atheism, but I just feel it is the most incredible grounding in storytelling and wonder, mythology. It's just an amazing book.
I support this. Get them when they're infants. Just whisper in their ear, there's no God. There are no gods.
It also made an entire course at university completely redundant. I took it. It was the easiest A I ever got. I don't think I even did the reading. I knew everything from D'Aulaire's Book of Greek Myths.
We'll be right back. Welcome back. This is the Book Review Podcast, and I'm Gilbert Cruz. I'm joined this week by Jean Hanff Korelitz, and we are talking about the sequel. Jean, when did you know that the sequel was going to be the title of this book, which is a sequel to your book, The Plot?
I was informed by my agent, whom I phoned and said, I'm thinking of writing a sequel to The Plot. And she said, yes, and we're going to call it The Sequel.
And you said whatever you say.
I was laughing too hard to say anything. I just thought it was the funniest thing I'd ever heard. It was so perfect. And I'm not sure I would have thought of it myself. I would probably have gone for some arty literary thing, but the subplot or something like that. But no, she was absolutely right.
Would you say that you have enjoyed many other sort of literary sequels? Series aside, because I feel like those are in their own category. Once you're Lee Child, once you have the Stephanie Plum series, there's 20 books. That's different than a sequel. But literary sequels, did you refamiliarize yourself with them?
I did make the decision when I was about halfway through the first draft of the sequel to use the titles of other people's sequels as the titles of the chapters in the sequel. Just a little bit of extra fun for me. And that allowed me to go romping through the fields of sequels, literary and otherwise. They're almost all the titles of novels. I think I have Paradise Regained in there. Through the Looking Glass is the sequel to Alice in Wonderland. So I had the occasion to go looking for other sequels, and I was reminded of the ones that I'd particularly loved. I read How to Save Your Own Life, which is Erica Jong's sequel to Fear of Flying, when I was a teenager, probably because it had a very provocative cover. I did not know it was a sequel. I had vaguely heard of Fear of Flying, but I certainly hadn't read it. And I just loved that book. I thought it was a fantastic book. And then towards the end of it, it occurred to me that I was missing something, that there was some withheld information here. And I mentioned it to someone and they said, basically, duh, this is the sequel to Fear of Flying. So then I went and read that, and that also was great. Of course, I love the Kate Atkinson novels with Jackson Brody. I think they're brilliant. Talk about complex and imaginative plots. She's just on her own level. She's amazing.
You wrote The Plot in the middle of the pandemic. You were in a house, upstate New York, not the middle of nowhere, but you were out of the city, certainly.
Close.
You were there with your husband, and by all accounts, you were really just heads down on this thing. And you didn't have anything else to do because the rest of us, you were in lockdown.
Except rage and tear my hair out in loathing and fear. Yeah. Apart from that, I had nothing else to do.
Duly noted. So you were doing these two things.
Yeah.
How's the process of writing this follow-up different in comparison?
It was a lot happier because we had come out what we are now calling the other side of the pandemic, whether it is or not, who could say. I was a lot happier politically. I was in my beautiful new home in my new neighborhood, which I love. And I was less worried about whether I could pull it off because I had already a strong sense of what was going to happen in this book, which is not the same thing as having a plot all lined up. But I had a landing point, was pretty sure I could get there. So it was a little more comfortable. But for the first time in my life as a writer, I'm aware that I have readers, which is an amazing feeling. And I didn't want to disappoint people who had liked the plot. So this is the downside to knowing that there are people out there waiting for you to do the thing that you're doing. I really didn't want them to say basically what the character says in the novel. Oh, the sequel is never as good. I put that there knowing that it would be a gift to whoever wrote a review of the book, but only hoping that the next sentence in the review would be, but this one is better, at least as good.
I think it's possible that our review says something.
I think it does, actually.
Wow,
I just read it this morning.
Really just fell into the trap there.
Sorry. I was trying to anticipate the criticism because, let's face it, I keep thinking about To Kill a Mockingbird and how desperately we all wish that sequel had not been written.
That was rough.
That was
terrible.
rough.
And that's referenced in the sequel.
It sure is. Yeah. Think of all the people who named their kid Atticus or their dog Atticus, only to find out what happened to Atticus Finch.
He has a complicated later in life turn.
I'm very upset. I'm still very upset about it.
Which are you more upset about, that or the person who ruined Murder on the Orient Express for you?
Ruining Murder on the Orient Express was a private experience.
Okay.
Ruining To Kill a Mockingbird was a very public experience. I have a lot of respect for Harper Lee. That was a unique book in American literature. This is a woman who wrote one book. It sustained her for her entire life. It brought her a lifetime of respect and approval. Financially, it supported her. There was no need to hear another word. Yeah. We were good. We were good. But now we know too much.
There is something about our culture. Maybe it's not an American thing. Maybe it's just a people thing. We just can't let stuff go. Like, we have to return to it. It was really a perfect, slim little book that generations of people have loved and have learned from and taken life lessons from.
Name their dogs after, name their kids after. Most
importantly, name their dogs after. And then this terrible thing. Readers or listeners, if you don't know what we're talking about, look it up. Look it up. The New York Times wrote a lot about it. In your first book, The Plot, before Jacob writes Crib, the book that will become his hit book that he himself has cribbed from somewhere else, he is teaching writing in a sort of slightly podunk writing program at Ripley College Upstate, a college or in Vermont.
In Vermont, yeah.
College that does not exist. And there is this, I can't remember if it's in the first book or the second book, you have this quote referring to the special purgatory for formerly promising writers from which so few ever emerged. Look, I work at the book review. I see how many books come out every single week.
Yeah.
And maybe there's a little spike in interest. And then the next week, 20 more books come out. On and on, week after week, month after month, year after year. As a writer who maybe has come into a different level of familiarity with the plot, what was your expectation of how your career would go? Were you someone who's like, I'm going to keep writing, but I don't know if I'm ever going to have a career where every book is pops or every book breaks out?
I don't think I ever used the word career in the way that I thought about what I was doing with writing. Certainly at the beginning of my life as a writer, I was very hopeful and very ambitious. I worked in publishing for a year. I watched my contemporaries, whose names are well known, sail into print with generally autobiographical novels about being stoned by the pools of Beverly Hills or in the nightclubs of New York. And I was very jealous. I thought trying to write about important, big quote unquote, important things and failing. Those books that I wrote were rejected really everywhere. And I certainly felt like I was not going to have the career that I wanted. The only thing I knew how to do was write the next book and then write the next book and then write the next book. And it was enough that I always managed to find somebody to publish that book, usually against the better judgment of their colleagues and bosses, because I had a terrible sales record. And as you know, we carry around our sales record like Marley's ghost in Christmas Carol. We're dragging around the numbers of our last novel and the novel before and the novel before. So I was not in a good position, but I was incredibly lucky to find one person who was willing to take a chance on the next book. And this was before I found really a haven with an editor who they're basically going to have to pull me off her. If she ever rejects a book of mine, they're going to have to call the cops to make me detach from her. But that level of good fortune, I could not have dreamed of in the early years of my career. It's been strange. In a way, it's an old-fashioned career where somebody takes a chance on a young writer and then waits for them to write something that people will want to read. That doesn't happen anymore. Incredibly fortunate to have finally found readers. I do not take them for granted. I had an incredible moment at the Sun Valley Writers Conference a couple of months ago where I was in a tent and I looked around the tent and it was full. And there were writers there whom I have admired for years. And I almost stopped the proceedings and said, "What are you doing here?" It was just a great, great moment. It took a long time, but I'm just so happy to have finally gotten here.
When did you start thinking of it as a career?
Maybe when you just said the word career a few minutes ago. Seriously.
Sooner or later.
I've been going novel to novel for so long. There's never been anything like a feeling of a plan or a pattern or anything like that.
Maybe it's the word itself. It makes it sound, as you say, as if someone has planned out their life and has this ambition to go higher and higher. You could also use the word career and just, this is what I do with my life. This is what I do for work.
I have no other marketable skills. I'm really good at making chocolate-dipped strawberries. That's about it.
People love those. When you go on like a flower website, they always try to add on the chocolate-dipped strawberries.
They're terrible. Don't eat them.
I've never added them on, so thank you. So your new book, the sequel, is in part about being a literary spouse. You are a literary spouse. Your husband is a literary spouse to you. Your husband is a poet, Paul Muldoon. And if he were here, I would ask him the same question. So what is the sort of in-house feedback, feedback loop that goes between your room and his room or wherever it is that the two of you are writing?
I generally do see each poem as it is finished. And I am asked for my opinion and I give it. Paul is not a natural reader of fiction. He's not sitting down with that big fat Victorian novel the way I am. He mainly reads nonfiction. He will usually wait until my book is finished. And then he'll read it, and occasionally he'll have a really good idea that I will implement. But I always know that I'm not in his wheelhouse. This is not what he reads naturally. You
have written about how there's another member of your family who was in the book world, who was an author.
Oh, Jean Hanff.
Someone who you've taken part of your name from. Tell us about that book, because there are several people at the book review who are such huge fans of that particular book.
Jean Hanff, I met when I was a teenager. I was very down on the fact that I had no literary relatives. Everybody was a therapist or a doctor. And then my mother said, we do have this cousin named Jean Hanff, and she's written books. And of course, I went and read her books. And then I wrote to her, and Helene lived only about a mile from me as the crow flies. But we'd never met. We were quite distant cousins. It was the days before Ancestry.com, so all we had was a kind of a scroll with her family tree on it, and at one end were her Hanffs, and at the other end were people I vaguely recognized, so we just called each other cousin. She lived long enough to read my first novel, the legal thriller, which she hated. So that was too bad, but she loved me, and she loved that the first thing that I ever published was a review of 84 Charing Cross Road in 17 magazine. And it was also the first time I used my middle name in print. And in the review, I said something about how my middle name had come out of the closet. She loved that. Whenever she introduced me to someone, she said, I brought her Hanff out of the closet. She was such an interesting person. And
she wrote 84 Charing Cross Road, as you said, which it's been a minute since I read it, but it's essentially a book and letters between her and the owner or the employees of a bookstore over in London, located
called
at
Marks and Company.
84 Charing Cross Road.
It's now McDonald's, I believe, but there's a plaque. You can go and see the plaque, which I do every time I'm in London. And there's a wonderful woman in London right now who has a one-person publishing company called Manderley Press, and she is republishing Helene's books. She began with a collection of Helene's BBC broadcasts called Letters from New York, and she's about to republish Underfoot in Show Business, which is Helene's memoir. It was published in 1961, I believe, in the middle of a newspaper strike. That was just so indicative of the bad luck that Helene faced all through her life. But it's my favorite of her books, and I'm really looking forward to the republication. I've written an introduction for it, and it's an incredibly charming book.
You Should Have Known, The Devil and Webster, this book. You've spoken a little bit about this in the past, but you love a sociopath. You love a good sociopath. We have another one here, Anna, just that wonderful gal. She's not a great person. What is the continued appeal?
The thing about Anna is, if she were here with us right now and you said, what do you want? What do you want? What is this about? She would say, I just want to be left alone. That's all she wants. Isn't it all you want? I'm making a
face right now. That is not what she wants. Or else she wouldn't have written this book.
She wants to be left to live her life, and she has been interfered with in ways that are serious, very, very serious, since childhood. And she would like that to stop. And every single person that she has harmed, she feels entitled to harm. She's not interested in harming you. She's not interested in harming me. She's just interested in stopping people who are harming her. And I don't know how I would disagree with that. I might disagree with her methodologies. She's somebody who likes a closed door. She does not like to leave a door open, which is why she leaves a lot of bodies around.
Yeah, this was one of my questions I was going to ask you. How much sympathy are we supposed to feel for her? I don't support murder, let alone multiple, but her dumb brother, her sort of dumb husband, her ungrateful child, you can, as you say, see all the ways in which, like, the person that she interacts with maybe is a little bit worse.
Yeah, if it were me, I would say, let's just have a good talk and just settle it over tea. But she's not me. Thankfully, I haven't had some of her very negative experiences either.
You have said in the past that anyone who wants to be a writer needs to read good books, but they also need to read bad books. And it's in the space between the two that someone can actually understand what it is to write a good book.
I absolutely understand why people say, oh, you need to read these great books and from them glean how to be a great writer. But that wasn't my experience. I spent plenty of time reading Judith Krantz and Sidney Sheldon, and I'm glad I did. They were great books, and they were rollicking tales, and I learned a lot from them. And I think our job, especially as young writers, is to read everything that you can. I often am asked by young writers to read their work and tell them if it's good. And I do read their work. And then what I tell them is, that's not the right question, because your job isn't to be writing right now. Write as much as you want, by all means, but your real job now is to read. And you'd think it wouldn't need to be said, but it does need to be said because it's shocking how few of them are actually reading. They have no concept that they are entering a tradition that existed before them and with luck will go on after them. And we all have to learn to understand that tradition before we hope to enter it.
I think it's in On Writing, the Stephen King book, that he says something that people probably say all the time, but it was the first place I came across it, which is you cannot be a writer if you are not a reader.
Oh, absolutely agree. Absolutely agree. And by the way, another great sequel is Dr. Sleep, the sequel to The Shining. That's one of my favorite sequels.
What do you think made it good?
He took a long time to get back to that character. The character was not thriving. He's barely getting by. And he's tormented, but he's not just going back to the Overlook Hotel to exorcise his ghosts. He has an entirely new set of challenges to overcome. And that story combines with the original story in a seamless and beautiful way.
This is a terribly hack question, but I'm going to ask it. And the fact that I called it a hack question makes it okay. Are you going to write a third book here?
I would not say no.
Jean Hanff Korelitz, thank you for once again joining the Book Review Podcast. Congratulations on the publication of the sequel.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was my conversation with Jean Hanff Korelitz about her new novel, The Sequel. I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review. Thanks for listening.